A wealthy man discovered a lost child in the woods and brought her to his disabled mother's home. Charles Harris stood by the large window in his corner office, overlooking the city below. The sunset painted the sky in vibrant oranges and purples, contrasting sharply with the cold, clinical atmosphere of his workplace. As the CEO of Harris Enterprises, a global company inherited from his late father, Charles had achieved what many would consider the pinnacle of success. Yet, as he loosened his silk tie and ran a hand through his graying hair, a deep sense of emptiness washed over him. At 45, Charles was the image of a self-made man, his face adorning business magazines, his name spoken with reverence in boardrooms, and his wealth beyond imagination. But beneath the surface of his achievements lay a profound loneliness that consumed him. The office darkened as the sun dipped below the horizon. Charles didn't bother to turn on the lights, the shadows mirroring his somber mood. He walked back to his desk, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. A framed photo caught his eye, a younger version of himself standing beside an elderly woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. It was his mother, Sandra. A pang of guilt struck him as he thought of her. Her health had been declining rapidly due to advanced illness, and despite his wealth and influence, Charles felt powerless against the relentless disease. He picked up the photo, tracing the outline of Sandra's face with his thumb. How long had it been since he'd seen her smile or heard her laugh? He set the photo down and gathered his things, leaving the office. The drive home was a blur of city lights and honking horns. Charles barely noticed the journey, his mind preoccupied with the emptiness awaiting him. As he pulled into the long driveway, the grand mansion loomed before him, its windows dark except for a single light in his mother's room. Stepping inside, the silence enveloped him like a heavy blanket. "Mary," he called out, not expecting to see the housekeeper at this hour. To his surprise, Mary appeared from the kitchen, her face etched with worry. "Mr. Charles, I was waiting for you. Miss Sandra has been asking about you all day," she said gently. Charles sighed, bracing himself. "How is she today?" he asked. "The same, sir. But I think it would mean a lot if you spent some time with her," Mary replied. Nodding, Charles felt a twinge of guilt for neglecting his mother. "I'll see her now," he said, heading toward Sandra's room. The house felt more like a mausoleum than a home, its empty halls echoing with memories of happier times. Charles paused outside his mother's door, taking a deep breath. Behind it lay not just Sandra, but a reflection of his greatest fear, losing oneself to illness. With a heavy heart, he turned the knob, ready for another evening of one-sided conversations and heartbreaking confusion. The next evening, after another exhausting day at the office, Charles found himself drawn to the forest bordering his estate. The weight of loneliness and the suffocating silence of the mansion drove him to seek solace among the trees. The crisp autumn air filled his lungs, offering a brief escape from his troubles. The forest was alive with rustling leaves, scurrying creatures, and the earthy scent of damp soil. As twilight fell, Charles's thoughts turned to his mother. He wondered if there was more he could do for her, some overlooked treatment that might help. Lost in his thoughts, he almost missed the faint sound of a child crying. His heart raced as he followed the sound, pushing through branches and over roots. Rounding a large oak tree, he spotted a young girl, no more than 8 or 9, huddled at its base. Her clothes were worn and patched, a stark reminder of the inequality just beyond his affluent neighborhood. Approaching cautiously, Charles softened his voice. "Hey there! Are you okay? Are you lost?" The girl looked up, her tear-streaked face a mix of fear and surprise. She pressed herself against the tree trunk as Charles crouched down, holding up his hands. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. My name's Charles. What's yours?" The girl hesitated before whispering, "Barbara." "Barbara," Charles repeated with a kind smile. "That's a lovely name. Can you tell me why you're out here alone? Are your parents nearby?" At the mention of parents, fresh tears filled Barbara's eyes. "I don't have any parents. I ran away from the group home. I don't want to go back, she said, her voice trembling. Charles felt a pang in his chest. Her vulnerability stirred something deep within him. Are you hungry? He asked, noticing how thin she looked. When she nodded hesitantly, Charles made a decision that would change both their lives. I have a big house nearby with plenty of food. Would you like to come and eat? We can figure out what to do next after you've had a good meal. Barbara's eyes widened with hope and suspicion. Really? You're not going to call the police? Charles shook his head. No police, I promise. Just a warm meal and a safe place to rest. What do you say? After a moment's hesitation, Barbara nodded and stood up. As they walked out of the forest together, Charles felt an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. For the first time in years, he sensed a purpose beyond his corporate responsibilities. Little did he know, this chance encounter would unravel a web of secrets, setting in motion events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his life, his family, and himself. As they approached the grand entrance of the Harris mansion, Barbara's eyes widened in awe. You live here? She asked, her voice filled with wonder. Charles nodded, a small smile forming. It's been in my family for generations, he explained, leading her up the winding driveway. For the first time, Charles saw his home through new eyes. What had always felt like a mausoleum of memories now held the potential for something more. The heavy oak door creaked open, revealing Mary's surprised expression. Her eyes flicked from Charles to Barbara, her brow furrowed in confusion. Mr. Charles? She asked cautiously. Mary, this is Barbara, Charles said, gently guiding the girl inside. She'll be staying with us for a while. Could you prepare some food? She must be hungry. Mary pressed her lips together but nodded. Of course, sir. I'll set something up in the kitchen. As she turned to leave, Charles noticed a flicker of disapproval in her eyes, but he chose to ignore it for now. Barbara stood in the grand foyer, her wide eyes taking in the ornate chandelier, the sweeping staircase, and the priceless artwork adorning the walls. She seemed both fascinated and overwhelmed, her small frame dwarfed by the opulence surrounding her. Come on, Charles said softly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Let's get you cleaned up before dinner. As they climbed the stairs, a faint melody drifted down the hallway. Barbara tilted her head, her attention caught by the haunting tune. What's that? She whispered. Charles paused, listening. A bittersweet smile crossed his face. That's my mother, Sandra. She used to be a composer. Sometimes she still plays, even though she doesn't remember why. Curiosity sparked in Barbara's eyes. Can we see her? Charles hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He led her down the hallway, stopping outside a partially open door. Inside, an elderly woman sat at a grand piano, her fingers moving slowly but deliberately across the keys. The melody was fragmented yet hauntingly beautiful. Charles knocked gently on the doorframe. Mom, he called softly. Sandra's hand stilled on the keys, and she turned toward the sound. Her eyes, clouded with confusion, settled on Charles without recognition. Then her gaze shifted to Barbara, and something changed. A spark of clarity lit up her features. Oh, Sandra breathed, her voice frail but warm. Who's this lovely young lady? Charles stepped into the room, Barbara following closely. This is Barbara, Mom. She's going to be staying with us for a while. Sandra smiled, her expression momentarily erasing the lines of confusion and age. Barbara, she repeated, as if savoring the name. What a beautiful name. Do you like music, Barbara? Barbara nodded shyly. Yes, ma'am. I used to sing in the church choir before. Her voice trailed off, a shadow passing over her face. Sandra either didn't notice or chose to ignore the girl's sudden sadness. She patted the piano bench beside her. Would you like to play with me? As Barbara hesitantly took a seat next to Sandra, Charles watched in amazement. His mother, who often struggled to engage with the world around her, was reaching out to this stranger, this lost girl they had welcomed into their home. The tender moment was interrupted by Mary's appearance at the door. "Dinner is ready, Mr. Charles," she announced, her tone clipped. Charles nodded, reluctant to break the spell that seemed to have fallen over Sandra and Barbara. "Come on, Barbara. We should let my mother rest. We can come back after dinner if you like." As they followed Mary to the kitchen, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just occurred. The house, which had felt so empty and lifeless for so long, now seemed to hum with a new energy. In the kitchen, as Barbara eagerly ate the simple but hearty meal Mary had prepared, Charles found himself studying the girl. Who was she really? Where did she come from? And why did he feel so drawn to help her? Little did he know that Barbara's presence in their lives was about to set in motion a chain of events that would unearth long-buried secrets, challenge everything he thought he knew about his family, and ultimately lead to both heartbreak and healing. In the days that followed Barbara's arrival, a subtle but noticeable change swept through the Harris mansion. The oppressive silence that had long permeated its halls was gradually replaced by the soft patter of small feet and occasional bursts of laughter. Charles found himself leaving work earlier, eager to return home to the unlikely family unit that was forming. One afternoon, as Charles was wrapping up a conference call in his home office, he heard the faint strains of piano music drifting through the house. Curious, he followed the sound to his mother's room, where he found Barbara seated at the piano with Sandra, their heads bent together over the keys. "That's it, dear," Sandra was saying, her voice clearer and more focused than Charles had heard in months. "Now try the next part." Barbara's small fingers moved hesitantly over the keys, picking out a simple melody. Sandra nodded, occasionally reaching out to guide the girl's hands to the correct notes. Charles stood in the doorway, transfixed by the scene before him. As the impromptu lesson concluded, Barbara noticed Charles and beamed at him. "Charles, did you hear? Mrs. Sandra is teaching me to play." Sandra turned, and for a brief moment, recognition flickered in her eyes as she gazed at her son. "Charles," she said softly, "this young lady is quite the talent." Charles stepped into the room, his heart swelling with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "That's wonderful, Mom. I'm glad you two are getting along so well." Barbara hopped off the piano bench, her eyes shining with excitement. "Mrs. Sandra told me she used to write songs. Can we hear one of hers, Charles? Please." Before Charles could respond, Sandra's hands were moving across the keys once more. The melody that filled the room was hauntingly familiar to Charles, a lullaby she had composed for him when he was a child. He hadn't heard it in years, not since before her illness had taken hold. As the last notes faded away, Sandra's hands stilled on the keys. She looked up at Charles, a hint of her old self shining through the fog of Alzheimer's. "I wrote that for someone very special," she murmured, her brow furrowing as she struggled to grasp at the memory. Charles felt a lump forming in his throat. "You wrote it for me, Mom, when I was little." Sandra's eyes widened, a flash of recognition crossing her face. Yes, of course, my little boy." But as quickly as it had come, the moment of clarity passed, and confusion settled back into her features. Barbara, sensing the emotional weight of the moment, quietly slipped her hand into Charles's. He squeezed it gratefully, drawing comfort from the small gesture. "Miss Sandra," Barbara said softly, "do you have any other songs you've written? I'd love to hear them." Sandra's face lit up at the question. "Oh, yes, dear, so many songs. They're all in my special book." Charles frowned slightly. He'd never heard of this special book before. "What book, Mom?" Sandra waved her hand vaguely. "My songbook, with all my compositions." It's," she trailed off, frustration evident in her expression as the memory slipped away. Barbara looked up at Charles, determination in her young eyes. "Can we look for it? Maybe if we find it, Mrs. Sandra can play more of her songs." Charles nodded, touched by the girl's enthusiasm and her obvious care for his mother. "That's a great idea, Barbara. Why don't we start looking tomorrow? It's getting late now, and I'm sure Mom needs her rest." As they bid Sandra goodnight and left the room, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of uncovering something important. His mother's music had always been a part of their lives, but he realized now how much of it had been lost to time and illness. The next morning, Charles took a rare day off from work, determined to help Barbara in her quest to find Sandra's songbook. They started in Sandra's room, carefully going through drawers and cabinets under Mary's watchful eye. It was Barbara who eventually made the discovery. Tucked away in the back of Sandra's closet, hidden behind boxes of old clothes, was a dusty leather-bound book. "Charles," she called out excitedly, "I think I found it." Charles hurried over, taking the book from Barbara's hands. As he opened it, his breath caught in his throat. Page after page was filled with handwritten musical scores, lyrics, and personal notes. It was a treasure trove of his mother's creativity, preserved and hidden away all these years. As he flipped through the pages, a folded piece of paper slipped out and fluttered to the floor. Barbara picked it up and handed it to Charles. With trembling hands, he unfolded it, revealing a letter addressed to him in his mother's handwriting. "My dearest Charles," it began, "if you're reading this, there's something you need to know about your past, about our family's past." Charles felt his world tilt on its axis as he continued reading, each word revealing a truth that would change everything he thought he knew about himself and his family. In the days following the discovery of Sandra's songbook, a palpable sense of anticipation filled the Harris mansion. Barbara, driven by a mix of curiosity and compassion, made it her mission to use the music to reach Sandra, to bridge the gap created by Alzheimer's. Each afternoon, after finishing her homeschool lessons with Mary, an arrangement Charles had quickly put in place, Barbara would rush to Sandra's room, songbook in hand. Charles often lingered in the doorway, watching these interactions with a mix of hope and heartache. "Mrs. Sandra," Barbara would say, her voice gentle but filled with enthusiasm, "I found another beautiful song in your book. Would you like to hear it?" Sandra's responses varied day by day, sometimes hour by hour. There were moments of clarity when her eyes would light up with recognition. "Oh, yes, dear. I remember that one. It was about—" She would launch into a story about the song's origin, her words flowing freely as if the fog of her illness had momentarily lifted. Other times, Sandra would stare blankly, confusion etched on her face. "Song? What song? Who are you?" On these days, Barbara's determination never wavered. She would simply smile, open the songbook, and begin to play, her small fingers dancing across the keys as she tried to bring Sandra's compositions to life. One particularly challenging afternoon, Charles arrived home to find Barbara in tears outside Sandra's room. His heart clenched at the sight. "Barbara, what's wrong?" he asked, kneeling beside her. Barbara wiped her eyes, her lower lip trembling. "Mrs. Sandra didn't recognize me today. She got angry and told me to leave." Charles pulled her into a gentle hug, feeling her small frame shake with suppressed sobs. "Oh, Barbara, I'm so sorry. Some days are harder than others with this illness. It's not your fault, and I'm sure deep down, my mother appreciates what you're doing." Barbara pulled back, her eyes red but determined. "I'm not giving up, Charles. Mrs. Sandra's music is too beautiful to be forgotten. I'll keep trying." Her resilience touched Charles deeply. This child, who had known so much hardship in her young life, was showing him the true meaning of perseverance and compassion. The next day, Barbara approached her task with renewed vigor. She spent the morning poring over Sandra's songbook, selecting a particular piece that had caught her eye. It was a lullaby, similar to the one Sandra had composed for Charles, but this one seemed unfinished, the last few bars trailing off into blank space. When afternoon came, Barbara made her way to Sandra's room as usual. Charles, intrigued by her intense focus that morning, followed discreetly, watching from just outside the door. "Mrs. Sandra," Barbara began softly, "I found this beautiful lullaby in your book, and it looks like you never finished it. I was wondering if maybe we could finish it together. Sandra, who had been gazing out the window, turned slowly at the sound of Barbara's voice. There was a moment of tense silence, and Charles held his breath, fearing another difficult day. But then something extraordinary happened. Sandra's eyes, usually clouded with confusion, suddenly sharpened with interest. "A lullaby?" she asked, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "Let me see, child." Barbara carefully placed a songbook on Sandra's lap, pointing to the unfinished piece. Sandra's fingers traced the notes on the page, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Ah, yes, I remember this one. It was meant to be a gift, but I never quite found the right ending. Can we try to finish it now?" Barbara asked eagerly. "I've been practicing the piano, and I thought maybe if we worked on it together." Sandra nodded, her movements becoming more animated than Charles had seen in months. Yes, let's see what we can do." For the next hour, Charles watched in amazement as his mother and Barbara bent over the piano, working on the lullaby. Sandra would hum a phrase, and Barbara would try to translate it to the keys. Sometimes Sandra would shake her head, guiding Barbara's hands to different notes. Other times, she would nod approvingly, a spark of her old self shining through. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the room, Sandra and Barbara played through the completed lullaby. The melody was sweet and tender, with a touch of melancholy that brought tears to Charles's eyes. When the last notes faded away, Sandra turned to Barbara, cupping the girl's face in her wrinkled hands. "Thank you, my dear," she said softly. "You've helped an old woman remember something precious." Barbara beamed, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "It's beautiful, Mrs. Sandra. Thank you for sharing your music with me." As Charles watched this tender exchange, he felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. Barbara, this unexpected addition to their lives, had managed to reach a part of his mother he thought was lost forever. But even as joy filled his heart, a nagging worry tugged at the back of his mind. The letter he had found in Sandra's songbook, with its cryptic message about their family's past, still weighed heavily on him. What secrets were still waiting to be uncovered? And how would they impact this fragile happiness they had found? For now, though, Charles pushed those thoughts aside, choosing instead to cherish this moment of connection and healing. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But for tonight, the Harris mansion was filled with the sweet strains of a lullaby and the warmth of newfound understanding. The following week brought a flurry of activity to the Harris mansion. Charles, inspired by Barbara's dedication to his mother, had arranged for a top-of-the-line digital piano to be delivered to Sandra's room. He hoped that having a proper instrument would encourage more musical sessions between Barbara and his mother. As the piano was being set up, Charles noticed Barbara hovering nervously in the doorway, her eyes wide with a mix of excitement and apprehension. He beckoned her over, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "What do you think, Barbara? Do you like it?" he asked, gesturing toward the sleek black instrument. Barbara nodded enthusiastically, her fingers twitching as if already itching to play. "It's beautiful, Charles, but—" She hesitated, biting her lower lip. "But what?" Charles prompted gently. "What if Miss Sandra doesn't want to play today? What if she doesn't remember me again?" The vulnerability in Barbara's voice tugged at Charles's heart. He knelt down to her level, looking her in the eye. "Barbara, what you've done for my mother is incredible. Even on the days when she doesn't seem to remember, I believe your music is reaching her. We just have to be patient and keep trying. Can you do that?" Barbara squared her small shoulders, a determined glint in her eye. "Yes, I can, for Miss Sandra." As the afternoon sun bathed the room in a warm glow, Barbara settled herself at the new piano. Sandra sat in her usual armchair by the window, her gaze distant and unfocused. Charles took a seat in the corner, trying to make himself as unobtrusive as possible. Barbara's fingers hovered over the keys for a moment before she began to play. The melody that filled the room was a lullaby she and Sandra had completed together the week before. As the sweet notes drifted through the air, Charles watched his mother intently, searching for any sign of recognition. At first, Sandra remained still, seemingly oblivious to the music. But as Barbara reached the chorus, something changed. Sandra's head tilted slightly, her brow furrowing in concentration. Then, so softly that Charles almost missed it, she began to hum along. Barbara, caught up in her playing, didn't notice at first. But as Sandra's humming grew stronger, the young girl's eyes widened in surprise and delight. She slowed her playing, allowing Sandra's voice to become more prominent. And then, in a moment that took Charles's breath away, Sandra began to sing. Her voice, though wavering and fragile, carried the melody with a sweetness that brought tears to Charles's eyes. Barbara, her face shining with joy, seamlessly adjusted her playing to accompany Sandra's singing. Your smile is my peace. It's the love life brings. You grow so much, my little one. With love I wrap you in. My heart for you, even from afar. As Sandra sang, her eyes slowly focused. The fog of confusion lifted, and for a brief, beautiful moment, she was herself again. She looked directly at Charles, and for the first time in years, he saw clear recognition in her gaze. As the final notes of the lullaby hung in the air, a moment suspended in time, Sandra's eyes never left Charles as she spoke, her voice clearer than it had been in years. I wrote that for you, Charles, when you were just a baby. I remember. Charles couldn't hold back his tears any longer. He moved swiftly to his mother's side, kneeling before her and taking her hands in his. Mom, do you really remember? Sandra smiled, reaching out to touch his cheek gently. My boy, my Charles, how could I ever truly forget you? Barbara watched this exchange with wide eyes, her own cheeks wet with tears. She started to slip quietly off the piano bench, not wanting to intrude on this precious moment between mother and son. But Sandra's gaze shifted to her, and her smile widened. Barbara, dear, come here. This moment is because of you. As Barbara hesitantly approached, Sandra reached out her other hand, drawing the girl into their embrace. For a long moment, they stayed like that. Charles, Sandra, and Barbara, connected by touch and the lingering echoes of the lullaby. Finally, Sandra spoke again, her voice tinged with a mix of joy and sorrow. I don't know how long this clarity will last, my dears, but I want you both to know how much you mean to me. She turned to Barbara, her eyes full of affection. You, my dear girl, have brought music back into this house. You've reminded me of the joy of creation, of the power of melody to bridge the gaps in my mind. Thank you. Then she looked at Charles, squeezing his hand tightly. And you, my son, you've grown into such a wonderful man. I'm so proud of you. But Charles, there's something you need to know, something I should have told you long ago. Charles felt his heart rate quicken. Was this related to the letter he had found? What is it, Mom? Sandra's expression grew serious. It's about your father, Charles, the man you knew as your father. He wasn't your biological parent. The room seemed to spin around Charles. What? But how? Why didn't you tell me? Sandra's eyes filled with tears. I want to protect you, to protect all of us. But now I fear that by keeping this secret, I may have put you in danger. Danger? What do you mean? Charles asked, his mind reeling from this revelation. But even as the words left his mouth, he could see the lucidity fading from Sandra's eyes. The fog of confusion was creeping back in, erasing the moment of clarity as swiftly as it had come. Mom, Charles said urgently. Mom, please, what danger? What do you mean? But Sandra's gaze had already drifted, her expression once again vague and distant. The moment was gone, leaving Charles with more questions than answers. As he looked up, he met Barbara's wide-eyed gaze. The girl reached out, taking his hand in a gesture of comfort. In that moment, despite the turmoil of emotions swirling within him, Charles felt a profound gratitude for this child who had brought music, joy, and now a key to unlocking his own past into their lives. But as the sun set outside, casting long shadows across the room, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that this revelation was just the beginning. What other secrets lay hidden in his family's past? And what danger had his mother hinted at? As Barbara began to play another soft melody on the piano, Charles resolved to uncover the truth, no matter where it might lead. In the days following Sandra's momentary lucidity and startling revelation, Charles found himself in a state of emotional turmoil. Questions about his true parentage and the cryptic warning of danger swirled in his mind, competing with the joy he'd felt at connecting with his mother and the growing affection he held for Barbara. One evening, as Charles sat in his study, poring over old family documents in search of clues, a soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Barbara standing in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted against the hallway light. "Charles," she said hesitantly, "are you okay? You've been in here a lot lately." Charles managed a smile, gesturing for her to come in. "I'm all right, Barbara. Just thinking about some things. How about you? How are you settling in?" Barbara padded over to his desk, her eyes roaming over the scattered papers. "I like it here," she said softly. "Everyone's been so nice to me. Even Mary doesn't seem to mind me so much anymore." Charles chuckled at that. It was true. Even the stern housekeeper had softened toward Barbara in recent weeks. "I'm glad to hear that. You know, Barbara, I've been thinking." He trailed off, suddenly uncertain. The idea had been forming in his mind for days, but voicing it aloud made it real, irrevocable. Barbara looked at him expectantly, her head tilted to one side. Taking a deep breath, Charles continued, "I've been thinking about your situation, about how you came to be here with us." Barbara's face fell slightly, and she looked down at her feet. "Are you going to send me back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," Charles said quickly, surprised by the vehemence in his own voice. "No, Barbara, that's not what I meant at all. Actually, I was wondering, how would you feel about staying here permanently?" Barbara's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Permanently? You mean like adoption?" Charles nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "Exactly like adoption. I know it's a big decision, and if you need time to think about it." He was cut off as Barbara launched herself at him, wrapping her arms around his neck in a fierce hug. "Yes," she cried, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Yes, I want to stay." Charles hugged her back, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. For a moment, all his worries about hidden family secrets and potential dangers faded away. This felt right. This felt like family. As Barbara pulled back, her face beaming with joy, Charles couldn't help but laugh. "Well, I guess that's settled then. We'll start the paperwork tomorrow." But as the words left his mouth, a sobering thought struck him. The adoption process would involve background checks, scrutiny of his life and finances. What if the mysterious danger his mother had hinted at came to light? What if his own uncertain parentage somehow disqualified him? Barbara, perceptive as ever, noticed the change in his expression. "What's wrong, Charles? Did you change your mind?" Charles shook his head, forcing a smile. "No, not at all. I just realized there might be some complications, but don't worry," he added quickly, seeing her face fall. "We'll figure it out, I promise." As Barbara skipped out of the room, bursting with excitement to share the news with Sandra and Mary, Charles sank back into his chair. He was committed now. Whatever secrets lurked in his past, whatever dangers might be lurking, he had to uncover the truth, not just for his own sake anymore, but for Barbara's too. The next morning, Charles made 2 phone calls. The first was to his lawyer, setting the adoption process in motion. The second was to a private investigator he'd worked with on corporate matters in the past. "I need you to look into something for me," Charles said, his voice low even though he was alone in his office. It's about my family, my real family. As he hung up the phone, Charles felt a mix of determination and apprehension. He was stepping into unknown territory, potentially unearthing secrets that had been buried for decades. But as he heard Barbara's laughter echoing from somewhere in the house, he knew it was worth the risk. Whatever the truth might be, whatever challenges lay ahead, Charles was certain of one thing. Barbara had brought light and life back into their home. She had reached Sandra in a way no one else could. And now she had given Charles a new purpose, a reason to face the uncertainties of his past and fight for a brighter future. As he left his office to join Barbara and Sandra for their daily music session, Charles felt a renewed sense of resolve. He would uncover the truth about his past, protect his newfound family from whatever dangers might be lurking, and give Barbara the stable, loving home she deserved. The road ahead might be difficult, but with the sound of music and laughter filling the once silent halls of the Harris mansion, Charles felt ready to face whatever challenges might come their way. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity in the Harris mansion. As the adoption process for Barbara moved forward, Charles found himself juggling his corporate responsibilities, his growing role as a father figure, and his secret investigation into his family's past. The private investigator he'd hired, a quiet man named Jack Reeves, had been digging through old records and following leads that stretched back decades. One crisp autumn morning, as Charles sat in his home office reviewing adoption paperwork, his phone buzzed with a message from Reeves. Asterisk found something. Meet me at the usual place. Urgent. Asterisk Charles's heart raced as he read the message. He quickly made excuses to Barbara and Mary, citing an unexpected business meeting, and drove to a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town where he and Reeves often met to discuss sensitive matters. The investigator was already there when Charles arrived, a thick folder on the table in front of him. Mr. Harris. Reeves nodded in greeting, his face grim. You might want to sit down for this. As Charles took a seat, Reeves opened the folder and began to speak in a low, measured tone. I've traced your birth records, Mr. Harris, and I've found some discrepancies. Charles leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. What kind of discrepancies? Reeves pulled out a birth certificate, sliding it across the table. This is your original birth certificate. Note the date of birth and the names of the parents. Charles's eyes widened as he read the document. The date of birth was correct, but the names listed were Sandra and Robert Mitchell. But that's my mother's maiden name, Charles said, his voice trailing off. Yes, Reeves confirmed. And this Robert Mitchell, he disappeared shortly after your birth. No death certificate, no records of him leaving the country. He just vanished. Charles's mind was reeling. What about Jonathan Harris, the man I thought was my father? Reeves pulled out another document. Here's where it gets interesting. This is an adoption record filed about a year after your birth. It shows that Jonathan and Elizabeth Harris adopted you from Sandra Mitchell. Elizabeth, Charles whispered, the name unfamiliar on his tongue. Your adoptive mother, according to these records, Reeves explained. She passed away when you were very young. It seems Jonathan Harris remarried to Sandra Mitchell, your biological mother. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Charles struggled to process this information. Are you saying that the woman I've known as my mother all my life is actually my biological mother, and the man I thought was my father adopted me? Reeves nodded solemnly. That's what the records show. But there's more, Mr. Harris. I found police reports from around the time of your birth. There were allegations of a baby trafficking ring operating in the area. Wealthy couples paying to adopt babies from vulnerable mothers. Charles felt sick. Are you suggesting that I was bought? It's a possibility we can't rule out, Reeves said carefully, but there's no concrete evidence. What is clear is that your adoption wasn't entirely above board, and there are some powerful people who might not want this information to come to light. As Charles left the cafe, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions and questions. He drove aimlessly for hours, trying to make sense of everything he'd learned. By the time he returned to the mansion, the The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. He found Barbara and Sandra in the music room, their laughter echoing down the hallway. For a moment, he paused outside the door, listening to the joyful sounds of their impromptu duet. Despite the turmoil in his heart, he couldn't help but smile. Taking a deep breath, Charles entered the room. Barbara looked up from the piano, her face lighting up. "Charles, you're back. Mrs. Sandra and I were just working on a new song. Want to hear it?" Charles nodded, unable to trust his voice. As Barbara began to play, Charles's eyes locked with Sandra's. In that moment, he saw something in her gaze, a mix of love, pride, and was it guilt? As the last notes faded away, Charles cleared his throat. "That was beautiful, Barbara." "Mom, can I talk to you for a moment? Alone?" Barbara, sensing the tension, quietly excused herself. Once she was gone, Charles took a seat next to Sandra, taking her frail hands in his. "Mom," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to try very hard to remember. It's important." Sandra looked at him, confusion clouding her features. "What is it, dear?" Charles took a deep breath. "Am I really your son? Your biological son?" The effect of his words was immediate. Sandra's eyes widened, a flash of recognition and fear crossing her face. For a moment, the fog of Alzheimer's seemed to lift, and Charles saw a clarity in her gaze that had been absent for years. "How? How did you find out?" Sandra whispered, her voice trembling. Charles felt tears prick at his eyes. "So it's true. Why, Mom? Why all the secrecy?" Sandra's grip on his hands tightened. "Oh, Charles, my boy, I wanted to tell you so many times, but I was afraid of losing you, afraid of what might happen if the truth came out." "What truth, Mom? What were you afraid of?" Sandra's gaze drifted to the window, lost in memories. "Your father, Robert. He wasn't a good man, Charles. He was involved in dangerous things. When I found out I was pregnant, I knew I had to protect you. Jonathan, he offered to help, to give you his name, his protection." Charles struggled to process this information. But why the adoption? Why not just raise me as your own? "It was complicated," Sandra sighed. "There were people looking for you, people who wanted to hurt Robert through you. The adoption was meant to throw them off the trail. And then, when Elizabeth died, Jonathan and we'd grown close. It seemed like the perfect solution. We could be a family, keep you safe." As Sandra spoke, her voice grew fainter, the clarity in her eyes beginning to fade. Charles could see her slipping away again, back into the fog of her illness. "Mom," he said urgently, "the danger you mentioned before, is it still there? Are we still in danger?" But it was too late. The moment of lucidity had passed, and Sandra was looking at him with the vague, confused expression he'd grown so accustomed to. "Charles, when did you get here? Is it time for my medicine?" Charles felt a wave of frustration and sorrow wash over him. So close to answers, only to have them slip away again. But as he helped Sandra to her feet, guiding her gently toward her room, he felt a new resolve hardening in his heart. He had uncovered part of the truth, but there were still so many questions. Who was Robert Mitchell really? What danger had Sandra been so afraid of? And how did all of this connect to his present, to his company, to Barbara, to the life he'd built? As he tucked Sandra into bed, placing a gentle kiss on her forehead, Charles made a silent vow. He would uncover the whole truth, no matter the cost. He would protect his family, Sandra, Barbara, even Mary, from whatever threats might be lurking in the shadows of the past. And somehow, he would find a way to build a future that honored the sacrifices of the past while embracing the hope of the present. With determination in his step, Charles left Sandra's room, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The truth was out there, and he was going to find it. The revelation about his true parentage left Charles reeling, but life in the Harris mansion continued its delicate balance of normalcy and underlying tension. Barbara's adoption process was moving forward, and her presence continued to bring light and music into their lives. However, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that there were still more secrets waiting to be uncovered. One evening, as Charles was reviewing some documents in his study, a soft knock on the door interrupted his concentration. He looked up to see Mary standing in the doorway, her usually stern expression replaced by one of uncertainty. "Mr. Charles," she began, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "I think it's time we had a talk." Intrigued by her demeanor, Charles gestured for her to enter. "Of course, Mary. What's on your mind?" Mary closed the door behind her and took a seat across from Charles. She seemed to be gathering her courage, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with Miss Sandra the other day about your true parentage." Charles tensed, wondering how much Mary had heard and what implications this might have. "I see. And what are your thoughts on the matter?" Mary took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Charles's with a newfound intensity. "It's made me realize that it's time for me to come clean as well. You see, Mr. Charles, I'm not just your housekeeper. I'm your aunt, Sandra's younger sister." The words hung in the air for a moment as Charles struggled to process this new information. "My aunt," he finally managed to say. "But how? Why have you been pretending to be just a housekeeper all these years?" Mary's eyes filled with tears, years of pent-up emotion, finally breaking through her stoic facade. "It was to protect you, Charles. To protect all of us. Your mother and I, we come from a complicated past." As Charles listened, Mary began to unfold a tale that seemed more suited to a thriller novel than real life. She and Sandra had grown up in a family with ties to organized crime. Their father, Charles's grandfather, had been a mid-level enforcer for a powerful crime syndicate. "Sandra and I, we wanted out," Mary explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "When Sandra met your biological father, Robert, we thought it was our chance. He promised to help us escape, to start new lives. But it all went wrong." Mary went on to reveal that Robert had double-crossed them, stealing valuable information from the syndicate and disappearing, leaving Sandra pregnant and both sisters in danger. It was then that Jonathan Harris, a wealthy businessman with his own reasons for wanting to thwart the syndicate, had stepped in. "Jonathan offered us a way out," Mary continued. "He would adopt you, Charles, giving you his name and protection. Sandra would pretend to be your adoptive mother, and I would stay on as the housekeeper, an extra layer of protection and a link to our past." Charles's mind was reeling. But why maintain the charade for so long? Surely the danger must have passed by now. Mary shook her head sadly. "The syndicate has a long memory, Charles, and there are still people out there who would love to get their hands on the information your biological father stole. Information that, whether you know it or not, you might have access to through your company." The implications of Mary's words sent a chill down Charles's spine. Could his company, the legacy he'd worked so hard to build, somehow be connected to this dark past? Does Barbara's arrival have anything to do with this? Charles asked, suddenly worried about the young girl who had become such an important part of their lives. Mary's expression softened. "No, Barbara's appearance seems to be a genuine coincidence. But Charles, her presence here, your decision to adopt her, it stirred things up. People are paying attention to the Harris family again, and that could be dangerous." Charles leaned back in his chair, trying to process everything he'd learned. His entire life, it seemed, had been built on a foundation of secrets and lies. Yet, as he thought about Sandra, about Mary, about the sacrifices they had made to protect him, he felt a complex mix of emotions: anger at the deception, but also a deep appreciation for their love and dedication. "What do we do now?" Charles asked, looking at Mary, his aunt, with new eyes. Mary reached across the desk, taking Charles's hand in hers. "We protect our family. Sandra, you, Barbara, we keep them safe. But Charles, there's more you need to know about your company, about the information your biological father stole. It's all connected, and I fear that by adopting Barbara, by bringing her into this family, you may have inadvertently put her in danger too." As Mary continued to explain, filling in the gaps of Charles's fragmented past, he felt a steely resolve forming within him. He had built his life on half-truths and hidden identities. But now, for the sake of Barbara, for the sake of his mother, and for his own peace of mind, he would uncover the whole truth. Whatever dangers lurked in the shadows of his family's past, whatever threats might be looming on the horizon, Charles was determined to face them head-on. With Mary's revelation, he had gained not just an aunt but an ally. Together, they would protect their unconventional family and forge a new path forward, one built on truth, transparency, and the unbreakable bonds of love that had sustained them through years of secrecy. As the night deepened outside the study windows, Charles and Mary began to plan their whispered conversations, laying the groundwork for the challenges that lay ahead. The Harris mansion, once a fortress of secrets, was about to become a battleground for truth and redemption. As the revelations about Charles's true parentage and Mary's identity settled into a new normal for the Harris household, Charles found himself increasingly drawn to uncovering the mysteries of Barbara's past. The young girl had brought such joy and light into their lives, yet the circumstances that led her to that fateful night in the forest remained shrouded in uncertainty. One rainy afternoon, as Barbara sat at the piano, her fingers dancing over the keys in a melancholy tune, Charles decided it was time to gently probe deeper into her history. "That's a beautiful piece, Barbara," he said, sitting down beside her on the piano bench. "Did someone teach it to you?" Barbara's hand stilled on the keys, a shadow passing over her young face. "My dad," she said softly. "He used to play it on his old guitar." Charles nodded encouragingly. "You've mentioned your dad before. Would you like to tell me more about him?" For a moment, Barbara was silent, her eyes fixed on the black and white keys before her. Then, in a quiet voice, she began to speak. "His name was Michael," she said. "He was the best dad in the world. He worked really hard, but he always made time for me. We'd go to the park, and he'd push me on the swing so high I felt like I touched the clouds." As Barbara spoke, the words began to flow more freely, painting a picture of a loving father who had fallen on hard times. Michael had been a social worker, passionate about helping children in the foster care system, but his dedication to his work had led him to uncover something dark and sinister. "Dad started staying up late, making phone calls when he thought I was asleep," Barbara continued, her brow furrowed in concentration. "He was worried about something. I heard him talking about missing kids, about money changing hands. He said the system was corrupt, that children were being hurt." Charles felt a chill run down his spine. Could Barbara's father have uncovered the same baby trafficking ring that Reeves had mentioned in connection to his own adoption? "What happened next, Barbara?" he asked gently, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Barbara's lower lip trembled. "One night, there was a loud noise. Dad came running into my room. He looked scared. He told me we had to leave right away, that it wasn't safe anymore. We got in the car and started driving. I fell asleep, and when I woke up," her voice broke, and Charles instinctively pulled her into a hug. Barbara buried her face in his chest, her small frame shaking with suppressed sobs. "When I woke up," she continued, her voice muffled, "the car was stopped. Dad was slumped over the wheel. There was so much blood. I tried to wake him up, but he wouldn't move. I was so scared. I ran into the woods and just kept running." Charles held Barbara tightly, his mind reeling from the implications of her story. Her father had clearly stumbled upon something dangerous, something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. And now, those people might be looking for Barbara. As Barbara's sobs subsided, Charles gently pulled back, looking into her tear-stained face. "Barbara, I'm so sorry you had to go through that. You're incredibly brave, you know that?" Barbara managed a weak smile. "Dad always said I was his brave little warrior." Charles nodded, his resolve strengthening. Your dad was right, and I want you to know that you're safe here. We're going to protect you, no matter what. But even as he spoke the words, Charles felt a nagging doubt. Could he really guarantee Barbara's safety when his own past was so fraught with danger? Over the next few days, Charles discreetly reached out to his contacts, trying to piece together more information about Michael's death and the allegations of corruption in the foster care system. What he uncovered was deeply disturbing. There were whispers of a vast network involving corrupt officials, unscrupulous adoption agencies, and even some high-profile business figures. Children were being moved through the system like commodities, their futures traded for profit. And at the center of it all was a name that made Charles's blood run cold. Mitchell Enterprises, his own company, the legacy he had built his life upon, seemed to be somehow connected to this dark underbelly of child trafficking. Had his biological father, Robert Mitchell, been involved in this sinister trade? Had Charles unknowingly perpetuated this evil through his business dealings? As he delved deeper into the investigation, Charles began to notice subtle changes around the mansion. Cars he didn't recognize lingered a bit too long on the street, unusual interference on the phone lines, and a sense of being watched that he couldn't shake. One evening, as Charles was tucking Barbara into bed, she grabbed his hand, her eyes wide with fear. "Charles," she whispered, "I saw a man outside my window today. He looked like one of the men who came to our house tonight. Dad, and I had to run away." Charles felt his heart rate quicken, but he forced a reassuring smile. "It's okay, Barbara. I'm sure it was just a neighbor or someone making a delivery. But thank you for telling me. Remember, you're safe here." As he left Barbara's room, Charles's mind was racing. The danger wasn't just in the past. It was here, now, threatening the fragile happiness they had built. He found Mary in the kitchen, her usually stoic expression marred by worry. "You've noticed it too, haven't you?" she asked without preamble. Charles nodded grimly. "They've found us. Or more specifically, they've found Barbara." Mary's lips thinned into a determined line. "Then we'll just have to be ready for them. This family has survived decades of secrets and threats. We're not about to let them win now." As Charles looked at his aunt, seeing the fierce protectiveness in her eyes, he felt a surge of gratitude and resolve. They had uncovered the truth about their past, about the dark connections that tied them all together. Now it was time to face the darkness head-on, to fight for the future they all deserved. With Barbara's traumatic past now laid bare, and the threats of the present looming large, Charles knew that the real battle was just beginning. And as he thought of the little girl sleeping upstairs, of his mother's moments of lucidity, of Mary's unwavering support, he knew that they had something worth fighting for. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, bound by the unbreakable ties of family. Not the family they were born into, but the family they had chosen and forged through love, music, and shared adversity. The weight of Barbara's revelation and the looming threats pressed heavily on Charles's mind as he drove to his office the next morning. The gleaming skyscraper that housed Harris Enterprises, or rather, Mitchell Enterprises, as he now knew it to be, no longer filled him with pride. Instead, it loomed ominously, a monument to secrets and potential corruption. As he stepped into his office, his assistant, Sarah, greeted him with her usual efficiency. "Good morning, Mr. Harris. The board members are already gathered for the emergency meeting you called." Charles nodded, steeling himself for what was to come. He had spent the night poring over company documents, following the trail of breadcrumbs that his investigation into Barbara's past had uncovered. What he had found had left him sleepless and sick to his stomach. In the boardroom, the tension was palpable. The board members, mostly older men who had been with the company since his father's time, regarded Charles with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Gentlemen," Charles began, his voice steady despite the turmoil within, "I have called this meeting because I have uncovered some disturbing information about our company's operations. Information that, if true, implicates us in illegal and deeply unethical practices." A murmur of discomfort rippled through the room. Charles pressed on, laying out the evidence he had gathered. Shell companies funneling money into questionable overseas accounts, partnerships with adoption agencies with spotty records, donations to politicians who had consistently blocked reforms in child welfare laws. As Charles spoke, he watched the faces of the board members. Some showed genuine shock and horror. Others, however, remained impassive, and a few even showed signs of anger, not at the revelations, but at Charles for bringing them to light. This goes beyond simple financial mismanagement, Charles concluded. If my findings are correct, our company has been complicit in a child trafficking ring that spans decades, and I intend to put a stop to it. The room erupted into chaos, voices raised in protest, denial, and outrage. But above the din, one voice cut through, cold and controlled. "That's quite an accusation, Charles," said Victor Blackwood, the longest-serving member of the board and his father's old friend. "One that could destroy this company, and you along with it. Are you sure you want to go down this road?" The threat in Victor's voice was unmistakable. Charles met his gaze unflinchingly. "I'm sure, Victor. The truth needs to come out, whatever the cost." What followed was a heated debate that lasted hours. Charles presented his evidence, fielded questions, and stood his ground against those who sought to dismiss or minimize the allegations. By the end, a clear divide had formed in the boardroom. Some members stood with Charles, horrified by the revelations and eager to make amends. Others, led by Victor, remained obstinately opposed to any action that might threaten the company's bottom line. As the meeting adjourned, Charles felt drained but resolute. He had taken the first step, but he knew the real battle was just beginning. Returning to his office, Charles found an unexpected visitor waiting for him. Jack Reeves, the private investigator, sat in one of the plush chairs, his weathered face grave. "Mr. Harris," Reeves said, standing as Charles entered, "I've got some information you need to hear. It's about your biological father, Robert Mitchell." Charles sank into his chair, bracing himself for more revelations. "Go on." Reeves pulled out a file, spreading photographs and documents across Charles's desk. Robert Mitchell didn't just steal information from the crime syndicate. He was a key player in setting up the entire trafficking operation. He used his connections in both the underworld and high society to create a network that could move children around with impunity. Charles felt the blood drain from his face. "And my adoptive father, Jonathan Harris?" Reeves's expression softened slightly. "From what I've gathered, Jonathan Harris was initially an unwitting participant. He thought he was helping to place orphaned children in good homes. But as he began to suspect the truth, he tried to back out. That's when things got complicated." The investigator went on to explain that Jonathan's attempt to extricate himself from the operation had put him, and by extension, Charles and Sandra, in danger. The adoption of Charles, the marriage to Sandra, even Mary's position as a housekeeper, had all been part of an elaborate protection scheme. And here's where it gets really interesting. Reeves continued. Before he disappeared, Robert Mitchell compiled a dossier. Names, dates, bank accounts, everything needed to bring down the entire operation. Then he hid it somewhere only his son could find it. Charles leaned forward, his mind racing. "Are you saying?" Reeves nodded. "I believe that somewhere in this company, perhaps hidden in plain sight, is the key to unraveling this whole sordid mess. And you, Mr. Harris, are the only one who can find it." As Reeves left, Charles sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had learned. His company, his very legacy, was built on a foundation of exploitation and suffering. Yet within its walls might also lie the means to bring justice to countless victims. Charles's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Mary. Asterisk strange car parked outside the mansion again. Barbara scared. Come home soon. Asterisk a surge of protective anger coursed through Charles. The people behind this trafficking ring weren't just faceless criminals anymore. They were a threat to his family, to Barbara, to Sandra, to Mary. And they were using the very company he had devoted his life to as a tool for their nefarious deeds. With renewed determination, Charles began to formulate a plan. He would find the dossier his biological father had hidden. He would expose the trafficking ring, whatever the cost to himself or the company. And above all, he would protect his family. As he gathered his things to head home, Charles caught sight of his reflection in the office window. The man staring back at him was no longer just a successful CEO. He was a son uncovering the truth of his origins, a guardian protecting a vulnerable child, a seeker of justice in a world shadowed by corruption. The path ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty. Charles knew that by pursuing this course, he was painting a target on his back. The same forces that had threatened his parents, that had orphaned Barbara, would surely come for him next. But as he stepped out of the office and into the night, Charles felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in his life, he knew exactly who he was and what he had to do. The fight for truth, for justice, for his family, had begun, and Charles Harris, or Mitchell, as he now knew himself to be, was ready to face it head-on. But as he stepped out of his office and into the night, Charles felt a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just living up to someone else's legacy. He was forging his own path, guided by the unshakable conviction that, no matter the cost, doing the right thing was the only choice he could live with. The elevator doors closed behind him, and Charles Harris descended into a world where nothing was as it seemed, and where the line between ally and enemy was blurred beyond recognition. The real battle for the soul of Mitchell Enterprises, and for the future of his newfound family, was about to begin. The drive home from the office that evening was a blur for Charles, his mind racing with the weight of all he had uncovered. The familiar streets of the city seemed different now, shadowed with secrets and potential threats. As he pulled into the driveway of the mansion, he took a moment to collect himself, knowing that inside, Barbara and the others were counting on him to be strong. Entering the house, Charles was immediately enveloped in a tight hug from Barbara. "You're home!" she exclaimed, her voice muffled against his suit jacket. "I was worried." Charles hugged her back, feeling a surge of protectiveness. "I'm here now," he assured her, meeting Mary's concerned gaze over Barbara's head. "Everything's going to be okay." But even as he spoke the words, doubt gnawed at him. How could he promise safety when dangers seemed to lurk around every corner? Later that night, after Barbara had been tucked into bed and the house had grown quiet, Charles found himself in his study, a glass of whiskey in hand. As the events of the day played on a loop in his mind, the boardroom confrontation, Reeves' revelations, the constant threat to his family, a soft knock on the door interrupted his brooding. Mary entered, carrying a tray with a pot of tea. "I thought you might need this," she said, setting the tray down. "It's Sandra's special blend. She always said it could calm any storm." Charles managed a weak smile. I think I need something stronger than tea tonight, Mary." Mary's expression softened as she took a seat across from him. "Want to talk about it?" For a moment, Charles was tempted to brush off her concern, to bear this burden alone as he had so many others. But the events of recent weeks had shown him the value of trust of family, and so, haltingly at first, then with increasing urgency, he began to speak. He told Mary everything. The full extent of the company's involvement in the trafficking ring, the hidden dossier, the divided board. As he spoke, he felt the full weight of his internal struggle come to the surface. "I've spent my entire life building this company, believing I was continuing my father's legacy," Charles said, his voice rough with emotion. "Now I find out it's all been a lie. Everything I've worked for, everything I've achieved, it's all tainted." Mary listened silently, her face a mask of sympathy and concern. When Charles finally fell silent, she leaned forward, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "Charles," she said gently, "you are not defined by the sins of your fathers, not Jonathan, and certainly not Robert Mitchell. You've built something remarkable with Mitchell Enterprises, and the good you've done, the lives you've improved through your work, that's real." Charles shook his head, unconvinced. "But at what cost, Mary? How many children have suffered because of the dark underbelly of this company? How can I reconcile the good with this evil? You can't, Mary said simply. But you can choose what you do now. You have the power to right these wrongs, to use the company as a force for good. As Mary spoke, Charles felt the conflict within him intensify. On one side was the businessman, the part of him that had dedicated his life to building Mitchell Enterprises into a powerhouse. This part of him whispered of damage control, of finding ways to distance the company from the scandal while preserving its core operations. On the other side was the man he was becoming, the adoptive father to Barbara, the son piecing together his true heritage, the seeker of justice. This part of him cried out for radical action, for tearing down the corrupt edifice regardless of the personal cost. And what about Barbara? Charles asked, voicing his deepest fear. By pursuing this, am I putting her in danger? Am I being selfish, risking her safety to clear my own conscience? Mary's grip on his arm tightened. Barbara is in danger regardless, Charles. The people behind this won't stop looking for her. By taking action, you're not just clearing your conscience. You're fighting for her future, for the futures of all the children caught up in this nightmare. As the night wore on, Charles and Mary continued to talk, weighing options and considering consequences. The internal struggle raged on, but slowly, a resolve began to form within Charles. He thought of Barbara, of her resilience in the face of unimaginable trauma. He thought of his mother, Sandra, fighting against the fog of Alzheimer's to share crucial truths. He thought of Mary, standing steadfast through years of secrecy to protect their family. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep through the study windows, Charles had made his decision. He would find the dossier his biological father had hidden. He would expose the trafficking ring, whatever the cost to himself or the company. And he would use every resource at his disposal to bring justice to the victims and protection to the vulnerable. The path ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty. Charles knew that by pursuing this course, he was painting a target on his back. The same forces that had threatened his parents, that had orphaned Barbara, would surely come for him next. But as he stood, stretching his tired muscles, Charles felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just living up to someone else's expectations or legacy. He was charting his own course, guided by an unshakable conviction that, no matter the cost, doing the right thing was the only choice he could live with. As he left the study to prepare for the day ahead, Charles cast one last look at the family photos on his desk. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them head-on, not just for himself, but for the family he had found and the future they all deserved. The following days were a whirlwind of activity for Charles. By day, he worked tirelessly at the office, carefully probing into the company's darker dealings while maintaining a facade of business as usual. By night, he pored over old documents and files, searching for any clue that might lead him to the hidden dossier his biological father had left behind. It was during one of these late-night sessions, as Charles sat surrounded by stacks of papers in his study, that Mary knocked softly on the door. "Come in," Charles called, rubbing his tired eyes. Mary entered, carrying a small wooden box. Her face was etched with lines of worry, and what Charles realized was a deep, long-held sadness. "Charles," she began, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "there's something I need to show you, something I should have shared a long time ago." Intrigued, Charles gestured for her to sit. Mary placed the box on the desk between them, her hands lingering on its worn surface as if reluctant to let go. "What is this, Mary?" Charles asked gently. Mary took a deep breath. "This box contains the last pieces of the puzzle you've been trying to solve. But before I show you what's inside, I need to tell you a story, my story." And so, as the night deepened outside the study windows, Mary began to unravel a tale that spanned decades, a story of love, sacrifice, and unimaginable choices. "You know that Sandra and I grew up in a family with ties to organized crime," Mary began. What you don't know is that I was the one who first met Robert Mitchell, your biological father." Charles leaned forward, hanging on every word as Mary continued. "Robert was charming, brilliant, and ambitious. He promised me the world, a way out of the life we'd been born into. I fell in love, hard and fast. But then," Mary's voice faltered. "Then what?" Charles prompted gently. "Then he met Sandra," Mary said, a hint of old pain in her voice. "It was like a switch had been flipped. Suddenly, I was invisible. They fell in love, and I was left behind." Charles felt a pang of sympathy for the young Mary and her story, but he sensed there was more to come. Mary went on to explain how, despite her heartbreak, she had remained close to Sandra and Robert. She had been there when they discovered Sandra was pregnant, had shared in their joy and their fear. When Robert came to us with his plan to steal information from the syndicate, to use it as leverage for a new life, I was the one who helped him, Mary admitted. "I thought I was doing it for Sandra and for you, the nephew I already loved, even though you hadn't been born yet. But part of me was still that girl who wanted to." The pain in Mary's voice was palpable as she described the night everything went wrong. Robert's betrayal, the syndicate's retaliation, the desperate flight to safety. "Jonathan Harris was my contact," Mary revealed. "He was an old friend, someone I trusted. When everything fell apart, he was the one I turned to for help." Charles's mind was reeling. "So you were the one who arranged for my adoption, for Sandra to marry Jonathan?" Mary nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "It was the only way I could think of to keep you both safe. But there was a price." She paused, gathering her strength for what came next. "Jonathan agreed to take you in to marry Sandra and provide a cover story. But the syndicate, they wanted assurances. They wanted someone on the inside, keeping an eye on things." The realization dawned on Charles with a sickening clarity. "You," he whispered, "you became the housekeeper to spy for them." Mary's shoulders sagged with the weight of her confession. "Yes, for years, I fed them harmless information, always walking a tightrope between keeping you safe and satisfying their demands. And every day, I lived with the fear that they would discover the truth, that they would come for you or for Sandra." Charles sat back, stunned by the magnitude of Mary's sacrifice. All these years, she had lived a double life, forsaking her own chances at happiness to protect him and his mother. But why reveal this now? Charles asked. Why take the risk? Mary's eyes hardened with determination. "Because it's time for this to end. Because you deserve to know the whole truth. And because..." She gestured to the box on the desk. "Because I think I've finally found a way to bring down the entire operation." With trembling hands, Mary opened the box. Inside were stacks of documents, photographs, and a small antiquated flash drive. "This is everything Robert compiled before he disappeared," Mary explained. "The original dossier, plus everything I've gathered over the years. Names, dates, bank accounts. Everything needed to expose the trafficking ring and the corruption that's protected it." Charles stared at the contents of the box, scarcely able to believe what he was seeing. "You've had this all along. Why didn't you come forward before?" Mary's face crumpled. "Because I was a coward," she admitted. "Because I was afraid of what would happen to you and Sandra if I did. But seeing you these past weeks, watching you fight for the truth, for justice, it made me realize that I couldn't keep hiding." Charles reached across the desk, taking Mary's hand in his. "You're not a coward, Mary. You're the bravest person I know. You sacrificed everything to keep us safe." Tears spilled down Mary's cheeks. "Can you ever forgive me, Charles, for keeping this from you for so long?" Without hesitation, Charles stood and walked around the desk, pulling Mary into a tight embrace. "There's nothing to forgive," he said firmly. "You're family, Mary. You've always been family." As they broke apart, both wiping away tears, a new sense of purpose filled the room. Charles looked at the box of evidence, then back at Mary. We have everything we need now, he said, determination stealing his voice. It's time to end this once and for all. Mary nodded, a mixture of fear and resolve in her eyes. It won't be easy, she warned. The people behind this, they're powerful, ruthless. They won't go down without a fight. Charles squared his shoulders. Then it's a good thing they're not just facing me anymore. They're facing us, our whole family. As the first light of dawn began to seep through the study windows, Charles and Mary began to plan. The road ahead would be dangerous, filled with challenges they could scarcely imagine. But for the first time in decades, they faced that future together, united by the truth and strengthened by the bonds of family. The final battle for justice, for redemption, for the future of not just their family but countless others, was about to begin. And this time, armed with the full truth and each other's unwavering support, they were ready to face whatever came their way. The following morning, Charles called an emergency meeting with his most trusted legal team. The boardroom buzzed with tension as he walked in, Mary by his side, carrying the box that contained decades of secrets and evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charles began, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "What I'm about to share with you will shake this company to its core, but I believe that facing this truth head-on is the only way forward." Over the next few hours, Charles laid out the entire story. The trafficking ring, the company's involvement, and his own complicated family history. He presented the evidence Mary had kept hidden for so long, watching as shocked disbelief, and in some cases, guilt washed over the faces of his colleagues. "As of this moment," Charles declared, "our top priority is to cooperate fully with the authorities to bring those responsible to justice. We will use every resource at our disposal to help the victims and their families." The room erupted into a cacophony of voices, some supportive, others outraged, many simply overwhelmed. But Charles stood firm, answering questions and addressing concerns with a newfound clarity of purpose. As the meeting adjourned, Charles's phone buzzed with a message from Barbara. Asterisk, strange men watching the house again. Mary says to be careful. Asterisk, a chill ran down Charles's spine. He had known there would be consequences to his actions, but the reality of the danger facing his family hit him hard. "We need to move quickly," he told Mary as they left the boardroom. "It won't be long before word gets out about what we're doing." Mary nodded grimly. "I'll make the necessary arrangements. We should get Sandra and Barbara to a safe location as soon as possible." But as they reached Charles's office, they found an unexpected visitor waiting for them. Victor Blackwood, the senior board member who had opposed Charles's investigations, sat in one of the plush chairs, a cold smile on his face. "Charles, my boy," Victor said, his voice dripping with false warmth, "I think it's time we had a chat about the future of this company and your place in it." Charles felt Mary tense beside him, but he kept his voice level as he replied, "I believe I made my position clear in the meeting, Victor. There's nothing more to discuss." Victor's smile wavered. "Oh, I think there is. You see, you're not the only one with secrets, Charles. Or should I say, Mitchell?" The use of his biological father's name sent a jolt through Charles. Victor knew more than he had let on. "What do you want, Victor?" Charles asked, his patience wearing thin. Victor leaned forward, all pretense of friendliness gone. "What I want is for you to reconsider this foolish crusade of yours. There are powerful people involved in this operation, people who won't take kindly to having their business disrupted, people who might be interested to know about a certain young girl you've taken in recently." The threat to Barbara, thinly veiled as it was, made Charles's blood boil. But before he could respond, Mary stepped forward, her eyes blazing with a fury Charles had never seen before. "You listen to me, Victor Blackwood," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "I've spent decades protecting this family from men like you. If you think for 1 second that we're going to back down now, you're sorely mistaken." Victor's composure slipped for a moment, surprise flickering across his face at Mary's intensity, but he quickly recovered, rising to his feet with a sneer. "You're making a grave mistake, both of you," he warned. "This isn't over." As Victor stormed out of the office, Charles turned to Mary, a mix of gratitude and concern on his face. "Thank you for that. But he's right about one thing. This isn't over. In fact, I think it's only just beginning." Mary nodded, her expression grim, but determined. "Then we face it together. All of us." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Charles worked tirelessly with his legal team to prepare for the inevitable investigations and lawsuits. Mary coordinated with trusted contacts to ensure Sandra and Barbara's safety, moving them to a secure location outside the city. As news of the scandal began to break, the media frenzy was immediate and intense. Reporters camped outside the Mitchell Enterprises offices and the Harris mansion, hungry for any scrap of information. Charles found himself thrust into the spotlight, hailed as both a whistleblower and a villain, depending on who was telling the story. Through it all, Charles clung to the memory of Barbara's smile, of Sandra's moments of lucidity, of Mary's unwavering support. They were his anchor in the storm, reminding him why he had chosen this difficult path. One evening, as Charles sat in his study reviewing the latest developments with his legal team, he received a call from the secure line he used to communicate with Mary. "Charles." Mary's voice was tense. "We have a problem. Someone tried to break into the safe house. Barbara and Sandra are fine, but we need to move them again." Charles felt his heart race. Was it the syndicate? Did they find out where they were? "We're not sure," Mary replied. "But there's more. I think I saw Robert." Charles froze. "Robert? My biological father? But that's impossible. He disappeared decades ago." "I know what I saw, Charles," Mary insisted. "It was only for a moment, but I'm certain it was him. He was watching the house from a car across the street. When he saw me, he drove away." The implications of this revelation sent Charles's mind spinning. If Robert Mitchell was still alive, still involved somehow, it changed everything. What was his role in all of this? Was he a threat or a potential ally? As Charles hung up the phone, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him more heavily than ever. He had started this journey seeking truth and justice, but now he realized the stakes were even higher than he had imagined. The company he had built, the family he cherished, the very foundations of his identity, all were being shaken to the core. And somewhere out there, the man who had set all of this in motion decades ago was watching, waiting. Charles stood, looking out the window at the city lights below. He had made his choice, stepped onto this path of truth and justice. There was no turning back now. Whatever challenges lay ahead, legal battles, threats to his family, confrontations with the ghosts of his past, he would face them head on. For Barbara, for Sandra, for Mary, for all the nameless victims of the trafficking ring, he would see this through to the end. The road ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger. But Charles Harris, or Charles Mitchell, as he now knew himself to be, was ready to fight for the future he believed in, no matter the cost. The revelation of Robert Mitchell's possible reappearance added a new layer of complexity to an already intricate situation. Charles knew he had to act quickly and decisively. With Mary's help, he arranged for Barbara and Sandra to be moved to an even more secure location, this time with round-the-clock security provided by a team he personally vetted. Meanwhile, Charles threw himself into the fight for justice with renewed vigor. He worked closely with state and federal authorities, providing them with all the evidence he and Mary had gathered over the years. The scale of the trafficking operation and the depth of corruption that had allowed it to flourish shocked even the most seasoned investigators. As the investigation progressed, Charles found himself facing battles on multiple fronts. Inside the company, he struggled against board members and executives who sought to distance themselves from the scandal, often at the expense of the truth. Victor Blackwood, in particular, proved to be a formidable opponent, using his connections and influence to obstruct Charles at every turn. Externally, Charles faced intense scrutiny from the media and the public. Some hailed him as a hero, a courageous whistleblower willing to sacrifice everything for the truth. Others painted him as a naive idealist, destroying a successful company over unproven allegations. The pressure was immense, but Charles refused to back down. One particularly grueling day, after a contentious board meeting and a barrage of hostile interviews, Charles received an unexpected visitor in his office. It was Jack Reeves, the private investigator who had first helped him uncover the truth about his past. "Mr. Harris," Reeves said, his weathered face grave, "I've got some information you need to hear. It's about your father, Robert Mitchell." Charles leaned forward, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "What have you found?" Reeves pulled out a file, spreading photographs across Charles's desk. "We've been tracking his movements since Mary's sighting. It seems he's been living off the grid for years, but now he's surfaced, and he's not alone." The photos showed an older man, unmistakably an aged version of the Robert Mitchell Charles had seen in old family photos, meeting with various individuals. Some Charles recognized as known players in the trafficking ring. Others were unfamiliar, but their furtive behavior suggested they were up to no good. "What does this mean?" Charles asked, his mind racing. "Is he still involved in the trafficking?" Reeves shook his head. "That's the interesting part. From what we can gather, he's been working against the ring, gathering evidence, making contacts. It seems he's been trying to bring it down from the inside." Charles sat back, stunned. The father he had never known, the man he had believed to be a criminal and a coward, had spent decades working in secret to right his wrongs. "There's more," Reeves continued. "We think he's been trying to make contact with you, but he's being careful. The people behind the trafficking ring, they're after him too." This information gave Charles a new perspective and a renewed sense of urgency. His father was out there, fighting the same battle, possibly in possession of crucial evidence. But he was also in danger. Over the next weeks, Charles redoubled his efforts. By day, he cooperated with authorities, testified before grand juries, and fought to keep control of the company in increasingly hostile board meetings. By night, he worked with Reeves and a small team of trusted allies to track down Robert Mitchell. The breakthrough came on a rainy night, as Charles was leaving his office late. A figure stepped out of the shadows of the parking garage, Robert Mitchell in the flesh. "Charles," Robert said, his voice rough with emotion, "I'm sorry it's taken me so long to find you." For a moment, Charles was speechless. Then, gathering his composure, he asked the question that had burned within him for months. "Why now? Why come back after all these years?" Robert's face was etched with lines of guilt and determination. "Because it's time to end the sun, once and for all. I've spent decades gathering evidence, making connections. I'm ready to bring down the entire network, but I need your help." As they talked, Charles learned the full extent of Robert's mission. He had faked his disappearance years ago to go deep undercover, working to dismantle the trafficking ring from within. It had cost him everything, his family, his identity, his peace of mind, but he had never lost sight of his goal. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you," Robert said, his eyes pleading. "I abandoned you and your mother, but this is bigger than us. There are children out there who need our help." Charles studied the man before him, this stranger who was his father. He thought of Barbara, of the trauma she had endured, of all the other children like her trapped in a cycle of exploitation and abuse, of his own journey from ignorant beneficiary to determined crusader for justice. In that moment, Charles made his decision. "Okay," he said, extending his hand to Robert. "Let's finish this. Together." As they shook hands, father and son united in purpose for the first time, Charles felt a shift in the air. The path ahead was still fraught with danger and uncertainty. The forces aligned against them were powerful and ruthless. But now, with Robert's insider knowledge and Charles's resources and determination, they had a real chance to bring the trafficking ring down once and for all. The final battle for justice was about to begin, and Charles was ready to risk everything, his company, his reputation, even his life, to see it through to the end. As the legal battles raged on and the investigation into the trafficking ring deepened, Charles found himself on an unexpected journey of healing and forgiveness. The process was neither quick nor easy, but it was transformative for all involved. The first step in this journey came in a quiet moment with Sandra, during one of her increasingly rare periods of lucidity. Charles sat with his mother in the safe house, holding her frail hands in his. "Mom," he said gently, "I know about Robert, about everything." Sandra's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Charles, I'm so sorry. We only wanted to protect you." Charles squeezed her hands. "I understand that now, and I forgive you, Mom, for all of it." The relief that washed over Sandra's face was palpable. Years of guilt and secrets seemed to lift from her shoulders. They talked for hours, Sandra filling in the gaps of Charles's fragmented history. And though she drifted in and out of clarity, the conversation was a healing balm for both of them. With Mary, the path to forgiveness was more complex. Her years of deception, even if well-intentioned, had created a rift between them. It took time and many long, often painful conversations for Charles to fully understand the depth of her sacrifice. "I was so angry when I first found out," Charles admitted to her one evening. "I felt betrayed. But now, knowing everything you've been through, everything you gave up for us, I'm in awe of your strength, Mary." Mary's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I never wanted to hurt you, Charles. Everything I did out of love for you and Sandra." "I know that now," Charles said, embracing her. "And I'm grateful. You're not just my Aunt Mary. You're the backbone of this family." The most challenging journey of forgiveness, however, was with Robert. As they worked together to bring down the trafficking ring, Charles struggled with conflicting emotions toward his biological father, anger at his abandonment, yet respect for his years of undercover work. One night, after a particularly grueling day of testimony and strategic planning, Robert approached Charles with a weathered envelope. "I've been carrying this for years," Robert said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Letters I wrote to you but never sent. One for every birthday I missed." Charles took the envelope, feeling its weight, not just physical but emotional. That night, he read through years of his father's thoughts, hopes, and regrets. The letters painted a picture of a man consumed by guilt, driven by a desperate need to right his wrongs, even at the cost of his own happiness. The next morning, Charles found Robert alone in the safe house's kitchen. "I read the letters," Charles said simply. Robert nodded, unable to meet his son's eyes. "I know it doesn't change anything. What I did, it changes everything," Charles interrupted. "I can't forget the years of absence, the pain it caused Mom and me. But I understand now, and I think I'm ready to forgive." The reconciliation was not instant, but it was a start. As they continued to work side by side, father and son began to build a relationship neither had thought possible. Throughout this process, Barbara played an unexpected role. Her resilience in the face of her own trauma, her ability to find joy and love in her new family, inspired everyone around her. She became a symbol of hope, a reminder of why their fight was so important. One evening, as the family gathered in the safe house, Charles, Sandra, Mary, Robert, and Barbara, Charles was struck by the improbable beauty of the moment. This group of people, brought together by tragedy and secrets, had somehow forged a true family. "What I want you all to know," Charles said, his voice thick with emotion, "is that no matter what happens with the investigation, with the company, with any of it, this right here is what matters most. We're a family. Unconventional, maybe, but real." Barbara, curled up next to Sandra on the couch, piped up, "Does this mean I get extra grandparents?" The room filled with laughter. Sandra's soft chuckle, Mary's warm laugh, Robert's deep rumble, and Barbara's gleeful giggle. It was a moment of pure joy amidst the storm they were all weathering. As the laughter subsided, Charles looked around at the faces of his family. He saw the lines of worry and years of pain, yes, but also strength, love, and hope. They had all been through so much, individually and together. The road ahead was still uncertain, the fight for justice far from over. But in that moment, Charles knew with unshakable certainty that they would face whatever came next as a united front. The healing wasn't complete, the forgiveness still a work in progress. Yet the foundations were there, built on truth, understanding, and a love that had survived secrets, separation, and suffering. Together, they were stronger than any force that might stand against them. And together, they would see this through to the end, whatever it might be. As the sun rose over the city skyline, casting a warm glow through the windows of the courthouse, Charles Harris stood at the precipice of a moment that would define not just his future, but the futures of countless others. The culmination of months of tireless work, legal battles, and personal growth had led to this day, the final hearing that would decide the fate of the trafficking ring and all those involved. Charles adjusted his tie, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He glanced around the room, drawing strength from the faces of his unconventional but fiercely loyal family. Sandra sat in her wheelchair, her eyes clearer than they had been in months, a testament to the power of truth and emotional healing. Mary stood beside her, a pillar of strength and unwavering support. Robert, looking older and more careworn than his years, nodded encouragingly at his son. Barbara, her young face a mixture of nervousness and determination, held tightly to Charles's hand. As the proceedings began, Charles listened intently to the testimonies and final arguments. Victims of the trafficking ring, including some who had been helped by Barbara's father, bravely shared their stories. Expert witnesses presented damning evidence that Charles and Robert had painstakingly gathered. Throughout it all, Charles remained focused, his resolve unshaken. When it was his turn to speak, Charles approached the stand with a calm he didn't entirely feel. He looked out at the packed courtroom, took a deep breath, and began to speak. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he started, his voice steady and clear. "The case before you today is about more than just corporate malfeasance or organized crime. It's about the fundamental value we place on human life and dignity. For too long, a shadow has loomed over our community, a dark network that preyed on the most vulnerable among us. Today, we have the opportunity, no, the obligation, to bring that shadow into the light and banish it for good." As Charles spoke, he didn't just recite facts and figures. He told stories of Barbara's resilience, of the countless children whose lives had been irrevocably altered, of the complex web of lies and secrets that had nearly torn his own family apart. He spoke of redemption, of the courage it takes to face uncomfortable truths and fight for what's right, even at great personal cost. "In conclusion," Charles said, his voice filled with emotion, "I stand before you not just as a businessman or witness, but as a father, a son, a nephew, a member of a family that has been profoundly affected by the events we've discussed here. I've seen firsthand the devastating impact of these crimes, but I've also witnessed the incredible strength of the human spirit. By holding those responsible accountable and committing to real, systemic change, we can ensure that no other child, no other family has to endure what so many have suffered. The choice before you today is not just about punishment, but about healing, about justice, and about the kind of society we want to build for our children." As Charles returned to his seat, a hush fell over the courtroom. Barbara squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with pride. The next few hours were tense as the jury deliberated, but when they returned, their verdict was clear and unequivocal: guilty on all counts. The aftermath of the trial was a whirlwind of activity. Sentences were handed down, reforms were set in motion, and the long process of providing restitution to the victims began. Charles worked tirelessly to transform Mitchell Enterprises, using its resources to support organizations dedicated to child welfare and anti-trafficking efforts. Months later, as the dust began to settle, Charles found himself back at the mansion, surrounded by his family. They gathered to celebrate Barbara's official adoption, a joyous occasion that felt like a new beginning for all of them. As they sat around the dinner table, Charles looked at each face in turn, marveling at the journey that had brought them all together. "I'd like to say something," he said, raising his glass. "A year ago, I thought I knew who I was and what my life was about, but I was wrong about so many things. Through all the challenges we've faced, I've learned what truly matters." He turned to Sandra, whose eyes were clear and focused. "Mom, you taught me the power of a mother's love and the importance of facing the truth, no matter how difficult." Sandra smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. To Mary, he said, "You showed me what true sacrifice and loyalty mean. Your strength has been our family's backbone." Mary nodded, her usual stoic expression softening with emotion. Then, looking at Robert, Charles continued, "Dad, your journey of redemption reminded me that it's never too late to try to right our wrongs. Your courage in facing the consequences of your past actions is something I'll always admire." Finally, he turned to Barbara. "And you, my dear Barbara, you've taught us all so much about resilience, about joy in the face of adversity, and about the healing power of love and music. You didn't just join our family, you helped create it." Barbara beamed, her face alight with happiness. "And you all taught me what it means to have a real family," she said, "one that sticks together no matter what." As they raised their glasses in a toast, Charles felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. The road had been long and fraught with challenges, but they had emerged stronger, more united, and with a deeper understanding of what family truly means. The Harris Mitchell family story didn't end with the trial or the adoption. There were still challenges to face. Sandra's health, the ongoing work of reforming the company, the lingering effects of trauma that each of them dealt with in their own way. But they faced each new day together, bound by love, truth, and a shared commitment to making the world a little bit better. As the evening wound down, Charles found himself at the piano with Barbara. As they played one of Sandra's compositions together, the sweet melody filling the room, he realized that this moment, this family, this love, was the truest success he had ever known. The mansion, once a symbol of loneliness and secrets, now rang with laughter, music, and the warmth of genuine connection. It was a testament to the power of truth, the strength found in vulnerability, and the healing that comes when we open our hearts to forgiveness and love. As the last notes of the song faded away, Charles knew that whatever the future held, they would face it as they had faced everything else, together as a family. And in that knowledge, he found a happiness and peace he had never known before. In the depths of our darkest secrets lie the seeds of our greatest redemption. This story reminds us that family is not defined by blood alone, but by the bonds we forge through shared struggles and unwavering love. It teaches us that it's never too late to confront our past, to seek the truth, and to fight for what's right. The journey of Charles, Barbara, Sandra, Mary, and Robert shows us that healing is possible, even in the face of unimaginable pain. Their story challenges us to look beyond appearances, to find the courage to be vulnerable, and to embrace the transformative power of forgiveness. Remember, your past does not define you. It's the choices you make today, the love you choose to give, and the battles you choose to fight that shape your legacy. No matter how broken you feel, no matter how many mistakes you've made, there is always hope for redemption and the possibility of creating a family, whether by blood or by choice, that can weather any storm. In the end, it's not our successes or our failures that matter most, but the lives we touch, the love we share, and the positive change we bring to the world. Let this story inspire you to confront your own truths, to extend forgiveness where it's needed most, and to build a life rich in love, understanding, and purpose. For in doing so, we not only heal ourselves but contribute to the healing of the world around us. This message aims to touch the emotional core by emphasizing themes of redemption, the true meaning of family, the power of confronting one's past, the possibility of healing from trauma, the importance of forgiveness, and the ability to create positive change despite one's background or mistakes. As we conclude this emotional journey, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If this story touched your heart, resonated with your own experiences, or simply entertained you, please show your support by leaving a comment. Your feedback means the world to us and helps us understand what content truly connects with our audience. Of course, we also value diverse perspectives. If there were aspects of the story you didn't quite agree with, or parts you feel could be improved, we encourage you to share your honest opinions. Your insights help us grow and create even better content in the future. Lastly, if you enjoyed this story and would like to see more like it, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your subscription is more than just a number. It's a vote of confidence in our team's hard work and dedication. It motivates us to keep crafting compelling narratives that explore the depths of human emotions and experiences. Remember, every comment, every subscription, every interaction matters. You're not just supporting a channel. You're fostering a community of storytellers and story lovers. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. We can't wait to bring you more stories that touch your heart and spark your imagination.